Today, we're going to see just how greedy the British Empire got back in the day. Now, I did a reaction to the British Empire just a couple of days ago. If you haven't seen that video yet, check it out. It's also in my history playlist, and I've linked to it in the description of this video. The video today was a suggestion, so if you have any suggestions at the end of this video on things I should watch regarding the British Empire or just anything else that you're interested in, please let me know down in the comments. Also, I'm just learning about this stuff, so there's a lot that I don't know, and I might not quite get everything right in the video. There's probably a lot of context that's missing in these, so if you have anything to add or to correct me on, then I'm all for it. I really do want to learn this stuff. I'm not watching just for the sake of watching, so I do read your comments, and I always appreciate them. So this video is piggybacking off of the British Empire one that I just mentioned, and in that video we saw this map of how much of the world the British Empire had invaded or conquered or taken over, and it was a lot. I think it said that at the height the British Empire had taken over like 25% of the entire world, which would make it the largest empire according to landmass. So I'm assuming that this video is going to be breaking it down into more detail, and hopefully I'll learn some extra stuff that wasn't in the previous video. So without further ado, let's check out how many countries England has invaded.
For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English and later...
I was like, why are they playing an American patriotic song at the beginning of this, but then I forgot that's the British national anthem. So confusing. I don't know the story behind that. I don't know why America took the British national anthem and turned it into a patriotic song, but...
For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English, and later the British, have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world.
Oh, okay. So is that why they hate each other so much? Because I know that there's this hate between France and England. I know that they've been at war with each other a lot in history. I guess this might be why. And also I think Ireland kind of had some beef with England too, which would make sense. But I didn't know the British Empire went back to 1169. I thought it was a more modern thing, like starting in the 15 or 1600s, maybe 1400s. Going back to 1169 is pretty impressive. So they were pretty dominant for over 800 years, which is pretty crazy.
Just take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this...
Oh wait, I didn't see the 1076. Okay. What's Brittany? Invasion of Brittany in 1076. I'm assuming that's somewhere in France. Wow. Okay, so maybe 900 years? Almost 900 years that England, Britain had its empire. I think that beats out the Roman Empire. I think the Roman Empire was only super dominant for maybe about 500 years or so before they kind of petered out.
There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece.
Okay, I thought they did the whole country, but...
Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions.
What does he mean by that, by the millions every winter? Is that a migration thing of the people of England? Because surely that's not soldiers he's talking about.
English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians. But that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701. And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years.
I think how it's pretty hilarious that modern-day Belgium is considered the 1600s. To Americans, that's like ancient because our history is like 200 and, well, we go back to the 1600s as well, but modern American history would have been like the 1900s on.
Years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948.
For me, World War II doesn't really qualify technically as an invasion. Germany was the aggressor. It wasn't like Britain was going in just to invade them. I don't know, I take that one with a grain of salt a little bit.
But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century.
That's Germany?
And the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between
Heligoland? I've never heard of that before, but that's part of Germany? Because that's up there by Denmark and Belgium and the Netherlands. Not Belgium, the Netherlands, sorry. Although, I guess, is that the German border up there too? I need to get more familiar with my geography.
Between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810
Again,
and
it's World War
1812
II,
during
like...
the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern...
Okay, so here's the thing. He's talking about Britain invading Finland, Estonia, and Latvia when Russia was trying to basically, I guess, conquer them at that point. Again, I don't know really about this period in history or this area. Britain would have been going there as support for them and not necessarily to like take over their country. So I don't really know what to think about that. To me, that's kind of a stretch as far as being considered an invasion
of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War.
Okay, but is a bombing strike considered an invasion? I feel like he's using the term invasion very loosely in this video. It's more of a video of like showing what parts of the world the British have interfered in at some point militarily. I mean, a lot of these are legit invasions, but some I think are very loosely defined, and I probably personally wouldn't categorize them that way. But this is still really incredible to see the reach of the British, for sure. Like, it does give you that perspective, and I mean, we're still in Europe. We haven't even gotten outside of Europe yet.
War, the British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932, and
Why is Iraq spelled with a K? I've never seen that before. And also the poor Middle East. I mean, they almost just never have peace. There's always some war going on or something like that.
And invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain,
not as
the United
favorite as
Arab
France,
Emirates,
though.
and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947.
I'm just looking at all of these invasions and wondering about the context for them, like the history. I mean, there's just so much history to learn. I just feel like there are 1,000 videos that I could watch to learn about all of this stuff. Of course, there are books to read, out there too, so videos are not the only way I can learn about this stuff, and they probably won't be, but there are just so many details in all of this that we're not getting right now, but I think they would be interesting to learn about.
Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while not outright invaded—
What? Hong Kong was a British colony up till 1997? How?
invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot.
Oh my gosh. We haven't even gone to Africa or the Americas yet. Did they also invade the poles? Did they invade the North Pole and the South Pole? Wouldn't put it past them.
Of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the...
That's... okay. I think there's a slight misspelling of that's Washington. I don't know when the United States kind of settled that area out there. I know it was probably close to that time. How did that work? I really didn't know that the British were in the Northwest and claimed that as their territory up until that time. Was that just kind of like because it's adjacent to Canada, which was a British, territory, colony or whatever. I'm assuming that that's probably kind of where that was coming from, but
There was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies,
we'll just take over the entire Caribbean, Britain. Goodness gracious.
Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French
Dominican
Revolutionary
Republic?
Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins' Year,
how did that
aka
go?
The more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as
They
part
really
of the
do not
so-called
like the
Venezuela
French,
crisis
do they?
to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The Empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time.
Wow.
And was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British armed forces during.
This was a question I had during the British Empire video, but how is he measuring the biggest empire in history? Is it just the number of countries that were invaded, the amount of landmass, the amount of people that were under the British rule?
During some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in.
Alright, I think he's done. I think the most impressive thing about this video for me is that the size of Great Britain is so small. It's amazing to me that a country that size could become so powerful. I mean, Great Britain is smaller than a lot of states here in the United States. And people look at America today as the superpower of the world and are impressed by it, but honestly, we are like way bigger than Great Britain. We probably invested more money, we have more people, so it kind of makes sense that we could be a superpower, but if you were to look at Great Britain on a map, you would never ever pick out that country to be like the biggest empire ever in the world. It's just crazy, and I feel like it warrants more investigation as to how they were able to pull it off. I mean, what was it about Great Britain that allowed them to establish this power and be so successful militarily versus a country like France or Germany or any other country in the world? I mean, what gave them the upper hand? I think there is a lot of British history, English history, that would be fun to learn about. Again, like I said in the previous video, my heritage does go back to the UK, so I have kind of like a personal interest in it as well. So I think this is a road that we'll probably go down, and I'll probably do regular videos on Britain and the UK, but we are still going to touch on other areas of the world because, like I said, other than like American history, I'm pretty ignorant about the history of other countries in the world and different regions. So if you could answer any of my questions down in the comments, I would really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe. There's more coming your way. So as always, stay tuned and we'll see you next time.